Mr. President, I am here on the floor today to talk a little bit about our economy and something that I think is very important that has been left unaddressed in this payroll tax compromise that I think is a real tragedy for our country and for my state, the state of Colorado, and most importantly for people that are suffering through this incredibly difficult economy. You know, it is not well understood by people, I think maybe even in this chamber, that our country's GDP, our gross domestic product, the economic output of our country, is actually higher today than it was before we went into this recession. You see it rising all the way in the 90s and 2000s, and then we had the worst recession since the Great Depression, and now we're seeing economic output that's actually at a level that's higher than it was before we went into the recession. Our productivity is higher today than it has been at any time in the history of the United States of America. It's become fashionable to talk about what's happened or not happened since the founding of our country. Since the founding of our country, our economy has never been more productive than it is today. And there are several reasons for that. Competition from abroad that has become a daily occurrence, something that we have to fight hard every day to stay ahead of, that's driven productivity. That's a good thing. Technology has driven productivity. That's a good thing. And the recession itself, Mr. President, you can see, drove productivity straight up as our businessmen and women in this country did what they had to do to get through this incredibly tough economic time, to keep their businesses alive, to keep their doors open, to keep a promise to the next generation of Americans. Productivity went ever skyward. That's a good thing. That's progress. And we're only going to become more productive over time as we face competitive threats from around the world. But, Mr. President, you can see what else has happened over this period of time. Median family income has fallen over the last decade for the first time in our country's history. Middle class is earning less today in real dollars than they were in the early 90s. And, as the President knows, we are producing this economic output with 23 or 24 million people that today are unemployed or underemployed in this economy. There are not jobs for these Americans in this economy, even though our output is as high as it was before we went into this recession. Now, there are a lot of people smarter than I am that could figure out the answers to this thing, but there are at least two big ones that we have to keep in mind. The first one is education. Because the worse the unemployment rate ever got for people with a college degree during this recession was 4.5%. 4.5%. That's the worst it got for people that had a college degree who could compete in the 21st century, even in the worst recession since the Great Depression. But as I've said on the floor here before, Mr. President, this floor, this chamber that has 100 seats, 100 desks, if we were poor children living in the United States of America today, only nine of these 100 seats would represent college graduates. Because 91 of 100 poor children in the United States in the 21st century cannot get access to a college degree. So that's job number one, to keep a promise to the next generation of Americans. But job number two, I think, needs to be driving innovation and job growth in this economy, which is what has brought me to the floor here today, because, Mr. President, we are failing in this package, among other things, to extend the wind production tax credit, which cuts right to the core of whether and how we want to compete in the 21st century in this global economy. And for people here or elsewhere that think these jobs aren't real in the wind industry, I brought some pictures. I brought some pictures of a plant, a manufacturing plant made in America, in this case in Brighton, Colorado, a manufacturing plant of the towers from which wind turbines are going to be hung, driving electricity and jobs in the United States. So we're not talking about some fly-by-night experimental industry here. This credit has triggered enormous economic growth in Colorado and across the country. As Congressman Steve King, a Republican from Iowa, wrote today in an op-ed he published, the production tax credit has driven as much as $20 billion in private investing. This isn't some Bolshevik trick, some socialist trick. $20 billion in private investment, in real American manufacturing jobs. Wind power accounts for more than a third of all new U.S. electric generation in recent years. In Colorado alone, Mr. President, I can tell you it has created 6,000 jobs in my state. It has moved our state toward a more diversified and cleaner energy portfolio so that Colorado today is a leader among the 50 states in diversifying our portfolio. Let's be clear, we have oil and we have coal and we have natural gas, we have abundant wind and abundant sun and entrepreneurial horsepower all across the Front Range. What we don't have is Washington's cooperation. What we don't have is the decency of people coming together and doing better than just keeping the flickering lights on in this place. And it's because they can't get any certainty out of Washington that developers and manufacturers are already starting layoffs already in anticipation of the credit expiring at the end of this year. This is the result of nothing other than our political dysfunction in Washington. Vestas, which has a huge manufacturing footprint in Colorado, from Windsor all the way south to Pueblo, is poised to lay off 1,600 workers if we fail to act. Iberdrola Renewables, also doing business in Colorado, has already laid off 50 employees for no reason other than our inability to get our work done. Nationally, 37,000 jobs are at risk, not to mention the ones we could have created after 2012, but won't if we let this credit expire. I brought a couple of other pictures just to make sure people know this is distributed all over the United States. Pennsylvania and in Texas. I know I sound like a broken record when I say this, because I've said it over and over again on this floor. But we should not be confused that the rest of the world is somehow waiting for us to get our act together. They're somehow waiting for us to cure our politics and do something that will actually solve for those curves that I started earlier and put Americans back to work, manufacturing and jobs that are actually driving middle-class family income up rather than down, which is what we're doing today. Our largest single export from the United States of America is aircraft. We export $30 billion a year. China's export of solar panels last year was $15 billion. Half our largest single export. They didn't export one solar panel 10 years ago, and we invented the technology here in the United States. In fact, some of us believe that we invented that technology in the state of Colorado. I'm sure the Chinese would love to have this business as well, and my concern is not that this is a temporary interruption in our wind industry, but this will become a permanent shutdown of our ability to drive economic growth across the country and across the United States. This is a perfect example of an industry that can move this unemployment level back up, an industry that we don't have today, one that's in its infancy, but 50 years from now, or 20 years from now, may be driving significant employment growth across the United States of America, an industry that, by the way, would drive this curve up as well. I met a young man in Logan County not long ago who was working on it. He was giving me a tour to the top of a wind turbine. I was standing on the very top of the box. It was about 10,000 feet in the air, Mr. President, or it felt that way to me. I was wearing the shoes that I'm wearing right now on the floor of the Senate, which is not what you should wear when you're at the top of a wind turbine that's swaying in the wind at the border of Colorado. But he told me that he would be unable to live in his home community and raise his family in his home community if it hadn't been for that job, a job that he couldn't have even imagined there being 5 years ago. And there it is today. These are high-quality, high-paying jobs in the United States of America, and it would seem to me that the United States Congress ought to figure out a way to support these industries. I actually don't believe any of these kinds of credits should be permanent. I want to be clear about that. I think that we would be doing ourselves and the country a service if we designed them in a way that phased out over time, because at a certain point, every business has to sink or swim based on its merits. And we're this close to being there with wind production. And we're this close to turning it over to the rest of the world. This is not a partisan issue. This is not a partisan issue. Last week, Republicans and Democrats from the Colorado delegation came together in the House and the Senate to urge a quick extension as part of the payroll deal. And, Mr. President, with your permission, I'd like to submit that letter for the record.
Without objection.
I know my colleagues, Senator Harkin and Senator Grassley, did the same with a delegation from Iowa. In fact, as I recall, Senator Grassley actually was the one that wrote this to begin with. We've also recently filed an amendment, a bipartisan, fully paid for one-year extension of the credit to the Surface Transportation Bill. And I'd like to thank Senator Moran, a Republican from Kansas, for joining me to lead that amendment. So there's plenty of support out there for us to get this done. And more important than that, Mr. President, there are thousands of people that are going to have to go home if we don't act, to their families and say that they were laid off of their job for no reason other than the political dysfunction here in Washington, D.C. And I think enough is enough. I cannot tell you how much I look forward to a time when we have a thoughtful, bipartisan, fact-based tax reform in this Congress. When we are thinking about our tax code and our regulatory code and asking ourselves, are we driving job growth here in the United States with these policies? Are we driving middle-class family income up with these policies? Are we addressing the income inequality gap by having an economy that truly does lift all ships? And as the President would make the point, are we dealing with the fiscal challenges that this country faces so that we don't strap our kids with this mountain of debt? I know there are people on both sides of the aisle that are anxious to work on this, but we have failed that test in this compromise measure. And it is my hope that at some point in the near future we can get in a vote on this amendment, Senator Moran's amendment, and we can put Americans back to work in these industries before we lose them forever. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.